So, all this discussion we've had so far leads to the question, if race is not a natural way, I should say, to classify people, then how are we supposed to think about race? Well, this leads us to the idea, as stated here in the slide, that race is indeed a social construction. That is to say, according to academics, scientists, anthropologists, historians, they have advanced the notion that race is something that's created by people rather than existing in the natural world, not unlike, let's say, water and H2O, right? Not to mention the various categories that were invented to think about living organisms, or how we think about the elements in the periodic table, right? That tabulation, the way we taxonomize that, when we try to do that with different races, and again, we're talking about skin color, right? It's something that doesn't exist in the natural world. This notion that you have people with different skin color, and attached to that are ideas of different biological differences beneath the skin color, not to mention non-physical features they supposedly possess, right? All those ideas, well, it's something that we created. It's not something that exists in the natural world, okay? So, as we know, we categorize according to skin color, and through the centuries, this categorization and the characteristics that were ascribed to them, they become naturalized, they become normalized, and we, in a way, forget that it was a social construction in the first place. We take for granted, well, I should say they in the past, right? They take for granted that it's indeed a natural way to categorize, that it's common sense, that it could not be otherwise. It's undoubtedly true, right? Again, I should emphasize this, that when we say race is a social construction, we're not denying, or, academics are not arguing that, hey, there's no literal existence of darker skin, right? No, of course not. Of course there's such a thing again as geographic ancestry. But what's being denied here is the essentialization of people within that group, especially when you start talking about them as being inherently different, biologically different, right? Like, again, the notion of blood. Not to mention, again, non-physical traits that serve to form hierarchies, right? Okay, so, yeah, race is a social construction. When did this happen, by the way, in history, in human history? Well, historians locate this project of race-making, to use that term. Race-making occurred during the age of European imperialism, as stated in the second line of the slide. So, what was this period? Well, it spanned between 1492 and the middle of the 20th century. You had World War I and World War II, and that was so cataclysmic that it led to the dismantling, the collapse of these European empires, right? But during that period in between, you see the project of race-making evolve, right? Because what's happening there is these various European empires, they're sending their colonizers and their merchants abroad and outside Europe, that is to say, right? They're colonizing and settling in areas of the world previously unoccupied by them, if not unknown to them, like, let's say, the Americas, right? North America and South America. And, of course, they're encountering persons of different skin color. And, there's this desire to control those lands, not just settle, but control them, to possess them as part of their empire, right? And to establish permanent presence, permanent settlement, in these far-flung areas in the world. So here in this project of initial settlement, and then through, conquest and controlling that land in the ensuing, centuries, right? Really, here's where race becomes foregrounded as a way to categorize. And again, this obviously involves power relations, right? As I mentioned previously, notions of the savage Indian, right, as inherently inferior. If you're more towards the Pacific region, exotic Orientals, barbarians even. These are examples of how they essentialize people within those areas that they controlled, if not colonized. Okay, by the way, I should mention this. What about before 1492? Did people really distinguish based on skin color? Because as we know, as hopefully we know, there was, before Columbus, there was the Old World and the New World, right? And in the Old World, comprised of Europe and, Asia and Africa, right? Not to mention the Islamic civilization there. Well, of course, they encountered each other. And of course, they acknowledged a different skin color. But was skin color foregrounded? Was it prioritized or emphasized as a way to distinguish among themselves? What do you think? Well, the answer, according to historians, is no, skin color was not emphasized as the primary way to distinguish. Rather, it was, maybe you could guess, right? It was religion. Okay, religion. Muslims versus Christians, and even in the Christian world, there were Protestants against Catholics, and even among Protestants, the different denominations, they were oftentimes at war with each other, right? You may have heard of the religious wars, right? Okay, so religion and what a class, to use that term, or category of religion you belong to mattered foremost. Okay, that is what was foregrounded. But after 1492, and in the United States especially, you see race being foregrounded. Okay, so again, just to emphasize race as a social construction, human beings, we created race. It's not something that's natural in the natural world. It involves human decisions, right? People decide who belonged in this race and who didn't. And actually, if you look at different countries and different societies, they have their own ways to classify races. So that illustrates to us that, it's not a universal category that spans all human societies, right? It's actually, in many cases, specific to that particular society, how they think about race. Okay, and moreover, such categories change over time. They have histories, right? And that's opposed again to natural entities like oxygen or H2O or mammal, which are universal. When it comes to races, they have a history. They change over time. So let's look at some examples of how in the past different races were understood, okay, how they were constructed, to use our term. In other words, let's look at different cases of race making, to use a term used by historians. All right, in our country, here's just a few examples, right? There was such a thing as, quote, the one-drop rule, as stated on the third line of the slide. The one-drop rule. Okay, and what does this refer to? You may have heard of this, actually. But this referred to laws that defined different races after the Civil War and the emancipation of slaves. And this actually spilled over to the 20th century until about, definitely ended with civil rights, but even a little bit before that. Okay, so what does the one-drop rule refer to in the definition of race? Well, here's what it meant. If you had one family member in your lineage, your family history, that was, let's say, African American, right? Then that meant that you were African American. Okay, let's say, I don't know, a grandfather, right? If that person was African American, but everyone else is white, it doesn't matter, right? According to the civic records, right? You having that one family member are African American, despite the fact that you may have blonde hair and blue eyes or green eyes. Didn't matter, right? You have one drop. And there's that term, by the way, that connects race with blood. Okay, just look at that term, one drop rule, right? There's this belief that, hey, blood is connected to race. So again, if you had one drop of African American blood, and again, that means, family member in the past, that means that you are black, regardless of your appearance. Okay, and here's what's interesting about that one drop rule is that, and this is especially true in the South, where they had their versions of one drop rule after the Civil War and during Jim Crow. Different states had different definitions of the one drop rule. In some states, it could be the great grandfather, and then you cross over a state line, it could be the grandfather rather than the great grandfather, right? Or great grandparent, I should say. Okay. All right. So look at that. You could be in one state and not be, quote, Negro or African American, and then literally cross over the state line where they have a different one drop rule, and you could be Negro in that state. Okay, so hopefully you can see how that's a human decision, right? The law, that is, that's defining you as a particular person within this racial group, the one drop rule. Okay, now today this no longer applies, but this was the case during this time period. What are some other examples? Well, this may surprise you because it is counterintuitive today. But in the past, especially during the 19th century and the first decades of the 20th century, the Irish and Italians were not considered white during this time. Okay? Especially in a customary sense. Irish, for example, well, there's this deep historical this deep hatred or enmity between the Irish and the English due to historical relations. Basically, England tried to colonize, right? Well, they did, excuse me. They colonized Ireland in the 1500s. Of course, the Irish resented that, so there's this deep hatred towards them. And because of that deep enmity, when the Irish started coming over, they were not considered white. They were considered one step above African Americans or blacks. Right. In fact, in the depictions of them, the anti-immigrant depictions of Irish coming over in droves after the potato famine, they were bestialized. That is to say, they were depicted as beasts. Right. And then this spilled over to the Italians, Southern Europeans, because, culturally they were different. They were Catholic, first of all, and they were darker skinned, Mediterranean. They were not considered white. Okay, so again, for us today, when we use the word white or Caucasian, we usually refer to persons of European descent and other regions like, the Middle East and so forth, even North Africa as being Caucasian, right? Well, here's a case where the Irish and Italians, considered white today, were not white. So this again demonstrates how race has a history, right? And that means it's a social construction.